Minim Zikaron, we signed to Remember event. My name is Ro'i Yamin, and I will be one of the facilitators of today's session. The session today is part of the iVision Live program, a program of daily virtual events about Israel-related topics. The program was created by the World Zionist Organization, Department of Diaspora Affairs, that I'm proud to lead its local delegation here to North America. Our department is being led from Jerusalem by a member of the WZO executive, Mrs. Gusti Yoshua Braverman. And we work every day in more than 30 countries around the world to connect Jews to Israel, to connect Jews to Israeli society and to maintain the role of Israel as a part of the Jewish modern identity. Today's session opened our week of events for Yom Hashoah, Israel National Holocaust Memorial Day. And when we're thinking about the Holocaust, we know that the Holocaust of the Jews in Europe and North Africa is composed of so many diverse stories, stories of individuals, of families, of communities. And we feel strongly that we are obligated to provide a stage to each one of those stories, to expose more aspects of the Holocaust and to create a better way that we will remember this historical event as a people. We will remember it better. This is why I was really proud to create today's session with two wonderful partners from two important organizations, Sharon Dror, the president of the Jewish Deaf Community Center, and Marla Petal, the head of the Deaf Holocaust Experience project. Together, we hope to expose the experiences of deaf survivors to as many hearing and deaf people from all over the world. And we are proud to say that for today's session, we have more than 200 people that registered from Israel, the United States, from Canada, Mexico, Argentina, and many more other countries. So welcome you all. We're about to listen today to 3 different testimonies. And after that, to open it to a Q&A section. So if you have any question, feel free to send it to through the chat section below, and the speakers will respond to them at the end of the 3 testimonies. And now, without further ado, I'm inviting my dear friend Sharon Dror from the Jewish Deaf Community Center to continue this session, and I'm wishing us all a meaningful experience. Thank you so much.
Hello. My name is Sharon Ann Dror, President and founder of the Jewish Deaf Community Center. Thank you, Roy, for the honor in asking us to sponsor or be one of the co-sponsors today. And it's really, the Jewish Deaf Community Center wants to memorialize this very important event. It reminds us that we should never forget what happened 75 years ago, when 6 million Jews and millions of others were killed between 1933 to 1948. And it was only 26 years ago when the JDCC hosted the Deaf Holocaust discussion in the Museum of Tolerance in Los Angeles with 6 survivors. And now 3 survivors are with us. 3 have passed away, rest in peace. Rose, Marion, but before we start the program, I want to mention that there seems to be a lot of difficulties in individuals coming into the meeting, to the webinar. There's only 100. There's nothing I can do about that right now, but hopefully you'll understand, and this is going to be recorded. And if you have any questions, specifically to the survivors or to their families, please type your question and we will present those when Marla gives your presentation. Thank you and welcome the first storyteller. Welcome, Janet Weinstock. Hello. Hello. Hello, everyone. I'm Janet, and I'll be telling the story of my grandmother, Hilda Weinstock, Rattner, Hilda Wiener Rattner. There were 6 of us, and we called her Oma, grandmother, Nana, Nanny, Granny, but we say Oma. When you see me sign Oma, that means Hilda's story that I'm telling, my grandmother's story from my mother's side, okay? My grandmother was born in 1904 in Vienna, Austria. Vienna, Austria. She had siblings. There were 5 of them. They were hearing. Then my grandmother, who was deaf, Oma, and her brother Richard, who was also deaf, the 2 of them, and then another sibling, Bella, who was hearing. So it's important to remember that there were 5 children, and the 2 middle siblings were deaf. My grandmother was the middle one. She was the middle child. So there were 3 questions that we were posed, and I'm going to answer the 3 questions here. The first one was, how was Jewish life, how was specifically Jewish deaf life in your hometown prior to the war, and how did it change during the war? So my grandmother, Oma, always and proudly told us of her life in Vienna, that prior to the war, life was good. Deaf people would gather, they would hike, they would get together for social gatherings in restaurants and clubs. And while my grandmother was young, she would participate in sports. I was really amazed at that. And even though there was anti-Semitism in Vienna prior to the war, deaf life was good. But I want to get back to the family because it's an interesting story. Now, when you're born deaf, your mother, of course, is naturally surprised, shocked. And 2 years later, when Richard was born, Richard born as deaf as well, grandmother was surprised as well. But my great-grandfather didn't really say anything about the fact that his 2 children were deaf. And my grandmother's mother, her name, by the way, was Mathilde. She went to see a doctor and asked, why would I have 2 deaf children? There's something wrong. Is something happened in a past life, or am I being punished for something? I mean, those are common questions among people who really don't understand and think that perhaps they did something wrong in a past life. And the doctor said, no, what I would suggest is, why don't you wait 5 and see you after they're 5 years old before you see, and try to have another child and see what would happen. So they were Orthodox. So it was important to them to have big families, you have to understand. So after Richard was born, there was a period of about 5 years, and then the next child was born hearing, Bella. So it worked out in their eyes. Now, the 2 deaf siblings knew sign language because they went to the deaf school there. It was the Dublin School for the Deaf, and they had deaf parents, some of them, and they were adept at signing in German, and that's how my grandmother and her brother Richard learned to sign. And they grew up in the school and yet in the presence of anti-Semitism, they grew up, but, well, here's a good example. When they went to a church to watch service, the nuns would say, whoever who is Jewish could not attend, could not come into the church. And they thought that it would be nice just to visit a church, but they weren't allowed to go in because the nun told them they could not. Let me go back just a second. The oldest sibling was bar mitzvahed and got a new tefillah on his bar mitzvah, a new talis. And when his brother got bar mitzvahed, he got the same thing. Of course, women were never bat mitzvahed back then. We didn't have bat mitzvahs then. And then when it was time for Richard to be bar mitzvahed, they didn't give him anything new. In fact, he got hand-me-downs instead. And my grandmother, of course, wasn't happy about that. She thought that wasn't right. But Richard said, no, it's fine. You just have to take it, what we can get. But yet, Alma wasn't happy with that. And grandmother said that oftentimes, we're deaf, and our great-grandmother would just sort of push them aside. But it was important that, in the Bible, it said it always said that we should be participants in the community. We should be active participants, and that always stuck with Oma. So during the Holocaust, Oma always talked about her siblings, and we looked at the timeline and found out that there was a parallel here with what happened in the Holocaust and what happened in Oma's story, of her experiences, of what she saw and what she experienced during the Holocaust. She saw Hitler in a parade from a long distance, but yet she could see him and realize the power and the evil that he carried within him, and it really frightened her. She also said that she could hear, when the speeches were being given, that the sound really struck her. She could actually hear the sound, the vibrations of the speeches. And Matilda did speak in German what the speeches were about. Not necessarily everything, but enough to give her an impression of what was going on. And it stuck with Oma. I mean, knowing that Hitler was truly evil and seeing the destruction of Jewish businesses, seeing how everyone was afraid, seeing, just these heart-rending experiences, the curfews, when the Nazis, for example, came into Vienna, they plastered their swastika flags everywhere. And the schools were not allowed, or deaf or Jewish, were not allowed to go to school. There were so many things that happened that really stuck with my grandmother, that she would gather from my great grandmother, and this fear remained with her. There's one story in particular that I remember. Our family lived in Vienna. My grandmother, her mother, my grandmother's brother, my grandmother's brother Richard, and my mom and my aunt lived in that apartment. And they lived there for several years. And at one point, it became a ghetto, and they were put into the same apartment. People were put into a very small apartment, and families were crowded together. And my family was part of this. We would just have to accept the situation as it was. They were just put into this ghetto. So my family moved in to one room, did the best that they could. Another family moved into another room in the apartment and did the best they could as well. And another interesting story was that at one time, a soldier knocked on the door, tried to see what was going on in the apartment, into all the apartments. And it happened in my family's apartment that the Nazi soldier entered. And it was a Nazi or SS or whoever with various other soldiers behind them, just barged into the apartment. And my grandmother's brother, Richard, saw them and saw that man and remembered that he used to work in a sewing shop. And he said, "Oh, well, there's nothing to see here," the soldier said. And the head Nazi soldier said, "Okay, fine, if you say so," and they all left. My grandmother said, that was really, really a scary experience, and particularly because of the other deaf people, and we didn't know what would happen if they found out we were deaf. Another time, my grandmother, it must have been out on the street. It was during curfew, and a lot of Jewish people, of course, were afraid to go out. They wouldn't go out during curfew. but she had to get food somehow. She had to go out. So what she did was that she tried to look a little less Jewish. So she went out at one time, went into the market, and the owner, of course, knew her. And as she was ready to take her meat, or kosher food, he said, no, 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 don't touch the kosher food. Go outside, motioning with his head, because there were German soldiers passing by. They were Nazis. And my grandmother understood, okay, fine. And she decided to take other non-kosher foods with her. So that was a very impressionable experience. After they survived, of course, there's a long story here, but I have to make it as brief as I can because I only have 15 minutes. But it's important to note that they did go to City Hall to get passports, IDs, visas, because they wanted to emigrate to America because their oldest brother, the two oldest brothers, had already been in America because job opportunities were better in America. There was no opportunities there, so they decided to emigrate to America. So once it appeared that they, at the time, the Jews who wanted to leave Vienna were free to leave at that time, early in the German occupation. So they got their passports, but the passports said they had a swastika right on the passport. And in the passport, there was Hilda, Sarah. All Jewish persons had to put in the name Sarah as their middle name. My family had no Sarah in the middle of their name, but they were forced to put in Sarah. And I actually have the passport. I've seen it myself, and it's really incredible. Anyway, so they got their passports. They got to England. It was dark. They went to Italy and wanting then to take a ship to America, but unfortunately, Mussolini in Italy, the dictator of Italy, and who also was a friend of Adolf Hitler, delayed everyone's departure, but finally they were able to leave around Passover, and the ship finally arrived in New York, and it was by that time Rosh Hashanah. I mean, can you imagine the time period there? And they got to America, and there were two brothers waiting for them at the New York harbor, very excited, very happy to see them. But unfortunately, they couldn't leave the ship. Of course, my grandmother and mother and my uncle and my mother and my aunt, all four of them were deaf. So they wanted to know why are they deaf? Are they ill or what it was? So they had to remain in quarantine and Ellis Island, and all family members were there in Ellis Island waiting, having to go through hearings and continue to wait in quarantine. While they were waiting, my grandmother and her brother, Richard, learned to sew, tried to earn a little money. Oh, I think my time is running out. Okay, all right. Well, I'm trying not to go over my 15-minute time limit. So my family stayed on Ellis Island for 5 months. 5 months. And they remained on Ellis Island, and I wondered if there were other families there who might have had similar experiences while they were at Ellis Island. But fortunately, there were people who were sponsors. A social worker in New York came and helped them out, and they were able to leave Ellis Island, but unfortunately, Richard and Oma had to work to pay off the money to the sponsorship. My aunt and her brother, they went to schools. Now, they weren't American citizens yet. So it just so happened that there was a benefactor, not a rich person, but you could say a philanthropist, an attorney, Simon Osterman, who happened to be the grandfather of a family friend, Joy Stern, and that was Joy's grandfather, and he was more than willing to sponsor them to go to the Lexington School for the Deaf. And my grandmother said that life from that point on, after the war, it was sad. Of course, you would know that before the war, they had a very different lifestyle. They lived in high fashion, and now after the war, their clothes were drab, and yet they were happy for the children, and that we were. I mean, it was sad, yes, but we had our lives, we had our language, we had our culture, we had our way of living and our food, and those are the traditions and the memories that we carried with us, and that was fine. And as far as Jewish life in New York, there was the Hebrew Association for the Deaf, where my grandmother was a faithful member. She would always sit in the second row on the side and had an important role to play. She went before the Hebrew Association for the Deaf. My grandmother would work, and Americans told her that you must go to learn English. And so my grandmother went to night school. And now you have to understand, it was a deaf woman who was teaching. And my grandmother took classes, and they were all immigrants in the class. They were all deaf immigrants. And they became friends, and some of them knew each other from their past lives in Europe. So that gave my grandmother a source of inspiration, and she was happy about her life there. So I think I'll just summarize by saying that my grandmother's experiences were just as they were, as we explained, and there she is. Thank you, Janet. Thank you so much. Thank you for sharing. And now I'd like to present our next speaker, Hedy, Udkovich-Stern. Please come on. Hello. Hello. I'm Hedy, and I'm the only child of Helen, Lemberger, Udkovich. And my mother was born in Vienna, Austria, in 1915. And she came from a well-respected hearing family. Her father was an attorney who often did pro bono work for no charge for those who needed his services so they could get their equal rights. It's like gay people would today. I mean, he would support people as often as he was able to. My mother was a school teacher, and she took her time getting married because she wanted to be a teacher. She had a younger sister who was hearing, who learned English in school. My mother went to the School for the Deaf in Vienna, just as Janet's grandmother did, and mother and aunt. And our next speaker, Ira, his grandmother and grandfather, we were all familiar with each other. They knew them as well. My mother went to a camp by the name of Theresienstadt in Czechoslovakia with her parents. Her parents were sent to Auschwitz and perished there. My mother died in December of 2006 when she was 91 years old. And she's regaled us with her stories and her experiences. I need to begin with what she was like. My mother was very gregarious, warm, loved people, except when it came to negative experiences, she refused to tell us those stories. So we almost knew nothing about her Holocaust experience. She would often talk about her friends, her family in Vienna. She was more than happy to tell us those stories, and that her family was very cultured, They would attend theater and concerts and lectures and participated in outside activities. They would go skiing, they would go hiking, or take walks, travel, and research, do whatever it is. They knew every single mountaintop's name. They knew every single type of tree and plant. But when it came to her negative experiences, specifically the Holocaust, she wouldn't go into detail. Her parents, thought that nothing would ever happen to them. They lived high-class, cultured lives in Vienna, so they never expected anything bad to happen to them. But that was their mindset. That was their perspective. So what I am able to share with you is a very small part, bits and pieces of what my mother's life was with her friends. One man who escaped to London, England before the war started, he was a very good friend, a girlfriend of, the father wasn't Jewish, but their last name wasn't Jewish. So they stayed in Vienna. When the war started, my mother wanted to talk with her deaf friends, but she went to a gathering and tried to catch up on news, but found out that it was time for the curfew. So she rushed back home as quickly as she could, and she had a Jewish star on her blouse here that said Judah, but the Nazis caught her and took her to a labor camp, and she had to clean and wash the filthiest toilets and scrub the floors. And it just so happened that that friend of hers who was walking by saw my mother working in the camp there, and my mother saw her and refused to acknowledge her because she didn't want to betray the fact that her friend was Jewish and that she might get caught and taken to the camp as well. So my mother continued to slave away in the camp. A few days later, my mother was released from the camp. Why, we don't know. But she was released and able to go home. When she got home, her mother and father were so distressed. What happened to you? We didn't know where you were for these last few days. How are you okay? Everything is fine. And my mother wouldn't discuss in detail what happened to her. She wouldn't give any details. My aunt, who knew English in high school, who learned in high school, she went to America. She was able to immigrate to America because she had an aunt and uncle there and able to settle in Los Angeles, California. So she was willing to sponsor. She was sponsored, but my mother couldn't go because she was considered an alien because she was deaf. If she had gone to America, they would have to be, take care of her, spend money, sponsor. So my mother wasn't able to go to the United States. And her parents, the three of them, were eventually all caught. Now, what happened to them when they were apprehended by the Nazis, we don't know, but they did go to a camp, and that was Theresienstadt. And I asked my mother, you went to Theresienstadt, but you don't have the tattoo on your arm like most people do when they were in the concentration camps. And she said, no, I was lucky I didn't get one. And I tried to ascertain what was going on. And afterwards, I read that, and I believe, and I assume, that Theresienstadt was considered a model camp. In other words, it was a camp so that if people had questions about what was happening to the Jews, what were the concentration camps, what were they like, they would have the opportunity to see this camp, that everything was fine there, that nobody was being mistreated. Just like it was the American Red Cross, for example, came to check out the camp, to look at Theresienstadt, and found that everyone was being treated fine. And though after discussion with lawyers, and that there were classes, and there was art classes, and there were music classes, and there was poetry and books, and kids were able to play, that nothing was so terrible about Theresienstadt, and everything was fine. So that's more than likely why my mother did not have the tattoo on her arm. So now, Mom, I asked, how was it that she got from Theresienstadt to London, England? In that time period, how was it that she was able to get there? So fortunately, what happened, my mother was a very good athlete. And prior to the war, she was part of the first Deaf Olympics, the Silent Games in Paris, France in 1924. So my mother participated as a swimmer for Austria. And it just so happened that my mother was very gregarious and she liked people and she would meet people from other countries and chat with them. And it so happened that she met a couple from London. And the woman herself was Jewish while her husband was not. But they maintained a friendship and they would chat. And she asked, in Vienna, what is it like for Jewish people? What is it like for Jewish people there? And my mother explained life in Vienna, and the friend of hers from London said, look, if there's any time you get in trouble or anything that you need, don't hesitate and come to us in London. And my mother said, thank you. And she kept that in the back of her mind. So after the Olympics, and they corresponded over the years. Now, how it was that my mother got from Theresienstadt to London, and got her papers, or what it was that she was able to escape, I have no idea. That's a secret that still remains with my mother, who's passed away to this day. What her sisters and her brothers, there's no information, none. So my mother went to London and stayed with the family for 14 years. She actually stayed in London for 14 years. She worked as a seamstress in a factory, and she put away a little bit of money until she was able, when the war was over, she wanted to see her sister in Los Angeles. So she went on the Queen Mary and arrived in New York City, and then by train got to Los Angeles and found her sister, and they had a happy reunion. Her aunts and uncles were all hearing. And after a few weeks, she wanted to see deaf people there. And she found the Los Angeles Club for the Deaf, LACD. And that's where she met my father. And 3 months later, they were married. And my mother moved and settled down in Los Angeles, became a US citizen. And my mother was involved in many deaf community, Jewish activities. She wanted to establish a temple for the deaf, not just a small group of people in a hearing temple, but actually a temple for the deaf. New York had one. Why couldn't we have one in Los Angeles? So my mother and father worked very hard in establishing Temple Beth Solomon. And my mother continued to be an active participant and member of the temple. It was very, very important to her. Her family was not that Orthodox. They were not that observant, but she was proud as a Jewish woman. And she continued to practice her faith, to go to temple. And that's where I got my Jewish upbringing, from that temple. And it is a big part of my childhood, Temple Beth Solomon. And my parents, my father passed away first, and my mother passed away, and are both buried at the Jewish cemetery. And when I got married to Ron, who was also from a Jewish deaf family in New York City, is it your great grandfather? You're the great grandson of who helped Janet's mother and aunt to get to school there. So my mother was so thrilled that we could continue our Jewish faith. And as you said, we have 3 deaf children whom we've raised as Jewish. And my mother couldn't have been more proud of the fact that we were all practicing our Jewish faith. So I could tell you more stories about the Holocaust, but unfortunately I can't, because I feel somehow that, our children are just part of the history, but we don't know what my mother's history is, except the fact that we are happy that she was able to survive the Holocaust. Thank you. Thank you, thank you. Thank you, Hedy. Thank you for sharing. Our next story will be Ira Rothenberg. Please come on, Ira, thank you. Finally. Ira, perfect. Ira. Ready? Okay. I'm Ira, and I'm going to be talking about my mother. Her name is Hertha. And as Janet and I said, we're cousins through our father and mother. Hedy, her mother, Janet's grandmother, my grandparents all knew each other. It was a different time in their lives, and it's a very small world. My grandparents went to school in Vienna, so that's why they all knew each other in Vienna. But after, just on the other side of the border was Slovakia. The name of the town was Bratislava. That's where my mother and her family came from. My grandfather was named Julius Gross. And his home and school were in Vienna, same school where you will see and we talked about. He was interested in meeting someone who was old enough that he could settle down with, date, marry. And so in Bratislava, he just decided to pay a visit. It was only 45 minutes away. And he went to the Deaf Club and made friends there, thinking perhaps he could meet somebody. And of course, one connection led to another. You could say it was word of mouth, or instead word of hand, in this case. It came to my great-grandfather's attention that he was able to meet my mother's maternal grandfather. They met and found out that they were both Jewish, and they both knew Hebrew, which of course helped connect the families, because not many people knew Hebrew then, and invited them for a meal. So that is where the families met each other. And my grandmother, the oldest, she was the oldest, her name was Henrietta. Then there was, of course, her siblings, a brother, 2 sisters, and only my grandmother, Henriette, and the last sister, the 2 of them out of the 4, did not survive, but the 2 did survive in the middle, the 2 middle siblings. So my great-grandfather, Gino was his name, was very Orthodox. And when my grandfather, Julius, met all these different people, he found this very young woman, the 2 of them were 21 years old, 21 years apart. And yet he liked her and waited until she was old enough at 16 to propose marriage. And then when she was 18, they were actually married. So my aunt was Renee. That's my mother's sister, Renee. This is her name sign, Renee, or this, because she had curly hair. She was the only hearing one, and my mother was deaf. Hertha, as I said, that's her name sign there. So my aunt, who could hear, would be the hearing person for the family and interpret for the family on the street. And she could sign. So whatever was going on in the street, she would interpret to the family, and my grandfather would listen and get as best as he can information about what was the news on the street. And my aunt would often help out with that as an interpreter. What life was like in the deaf community back then? Deaf people would often stop by unexpectedly, unannounced, just drop in. And my grandmother worked at home. My grandfather worked nearby as a jeweler, working in a jewelry shop. And whatever deaf people were in the neighborhood, they would stop by, and oftentimes my grandfather could read and write well. So he would read the newspaper for them and convey the news in the news, sort of more than that. And I don't know too much, but deaf people did enjoy visiting them and sharing information. I found out later that some deaf people liked my grandmother best because she was the best storyteller, because she often told great Bible stories. She was able to perform Bible stories in sign, and my grandfather would convey stories in the newspaper. They both had their own particular skills. As Janet mentioned, wait, let me hold that thought. The school, they never went to the school for the deaf in Vienna. They never went until the war was over. And then that's when they were able to start school. And they started late, and that was because my grandparents saw the Nazis as they began to take over. And in Austria there, what if they thought perhaps the border was closed and it would be hard to, I mean, they decided it would be best that my mother should stay home and not be in school in case something should happen and they weren't able to return home. So at 8 and 9 years old, instead of going to school, they played at home. At one point, my grandparents decided to move both my aunt, Renee, and my mother, Hertha, to a place outside in the country on a farm with a deaf couple. And that deaf couple were not Jewish, but my grandfather often gave them money to support them. And it so happened that the Nazis took both my grandparents and sent them to, deported them. I think it's probably to Auschwitz that they were sent to. I believe they went to Auschwitz. And it so happened that my aunt, Renee, and my mother, I remember my aunt was older than my mother, and she was the hearing person for the family. So naturally, she wasn't bossy. She was a little bossy, but she decided to take over leadership. And even though my mother wanted to leave the family and go to the city, and found that her parents were gone. I mean, to be brief, I need to be brief here. They ended up going to a camp which was called Bergen-Belsen. And they were there for 9 months until they were liberated at the end of the war. They did not have the tattoo on their arms. Most of them never, they were fortunate enough not to have the tattoos on their arms. There were two interesting situations. My aunt my mother says she never forgot that my aunt could make any situation dangerous. When they got to Bergen-Belsen, naturally, they were in line to be inspected. The man at the desk, a doctor, but more like somebody who decided who would go and who would stay. And my aunt was in line first and spoke, and then was allowed to enter. Now, when it came to my mother's turn, the gentleman spoke to my mother, but of course, being deaf, she couldn't understand. So my aunt came back into the line and said, "She's deaf." And the inspector said, "Oh, she's deaf, really?" Well, then, as he turned to look to his superior, someone else, my aunt bit his hand as if to distract or say, oh, I mean, my mother felt so endangered at this very point. But for some reason, the inspector let my mother go with my aunt, who dragged her by the arm and essentially saved her. And that was, of course, a very close call that my mother never forgot. It so happened that there was typhus in the camp, and they all had to sleep in infirmary. And my aunt came to check on my mother, trying to get some information about her, and a different doctor, a nurse perhaps, checked each bed. And when they stopped, one nurse, my aunt remembers her name, the Dr. Kramer, remembered that my aunt was hearing and she could speak German as well. So even though our home was in Bratislava, and they spoke Hungarian, that was our home language, but we could also our family could also speak German too. So the doctor saw my mother that was deaf and said, I want to experiment on this young woman because she's deaf and perhaps we can get some information from this. And my aunt saw this and said, don't you dare touch her. And whoever it was, maybe he wasn't familiar with German language, they said, don't you. There's two different ways to say you. There is a you, which is C, S-I-E, which means what you say to a child, like a doctor would say to a child, or teacher would say to a child, or someone, you would say C. And then there's the familiar co-worker that you might refer to, and that's do. So when the doctor said, I want to experiment, my aunt used the familiar do, not the C, the do. Don't you dare. And the doctor, the good thing the doctor thought of this as being very funny. And my aunt, of course, was very, very determined. And she, of course, looked very Aryan. And she had blonde hair and blue eyes. And for whatever reason, they left, and that was the second time that my aunt saved my mother. It just so happened that my aunt then eventually got sick with typhus, and my mother got well, and my mother had to help my aunt in turn. For example, there was a water pump, and she was able to get water, even though they were in prison there, and there wasn't much water coming out of the pump, so she did the best she could to fight to get water and bring it to my aunt. She would do the best she could to give water to my aunt if she needed some. And my aunt, of course, was very grateful for this. There wasn't much there, but after a few days, she noticed that my aunt was improving. And being that she was the only deaf person in the camp, she had to be on her own. And my mother said to my aunt, do not give up. You have to fight. You have to fight. There are other ways that you can fight for your life. So eventually they were able to be liberated. When the war was over, they immigrated to Sweden, and they were there with other children, other orphans who had no parents. And it was there that they found a school. Of course, they had to separate them because my aunt was hearing. And there was a school for the deaf there, for deaf students there in Sweden. That was in the town of Stockholm, Sweden. And there at the School for the Deaf, it's a very long word. This is a sign. This is the sign for the School for the Deaf. It is the Manila Skolan School for the Deaf, and it's still there to this day. It's still there. I think it might have relocated, but it's still there. And my mother was there for 2 years, and she had some relatives in the United States, some who had emigrated before the war. So they sponsored them to come to New York, whereupon they went to the School for the Deaf, where my cousin Janet and the same school, the Lexington School for the Deaf, went to. And they became involved in the deaf community and schools and friends, and they also participated in social events. And that's how my mother met my father. My father was born in the United States. And then I was born, and then my father's brother is Janet's father. So that's how we're all related. Well, we were involved in Temple Beth Or, and they had a Sunday school, like Hedy just mentioned. I learned through Sunday school about my Judaism. It helped that the teacher was deaf. All the teachers were deaf, and they taught me how to read Hebrew, but it was letter by letter. Essentially, it was phonetically. that we learned Hebrew. And as far as events went, there were high holiday events. There was Passover, of course, that I would always attend back then. This is in the 1960s, the 1970s. Of course, we would get into our best holiday clothing. We would expect to participate, and that was our life then. And I was bar mitzvahed there at Temple Beth Or. And that is my life. Now, what my mother wants to say about the traditions that she passed along, if you have an opportunity, if you have a chance, and in life, there's something in life, grab it and do the best you can. Don't ever pass up an opportunity that life presents you. Do the best you can and grab it and live it. Thank you, Ira. Thank you for sharing your story. So now we're going to welcome Marla Petal, who will give us a PowerPoint presentation of various slides, and then she'll talk at length. Welcome, Marla.
Hi, everybody. I'm just saying hello, and now I'm going to share my screen so you can see a few slides here. And can I just get a confirmation that you're seeing a picture of the Taub Schumann Institute School for the Deaf in Dublin that was referred to earlier? Can everybody see that, the slide?
We got a yes.
Okay, thank you. So there were several schools for the deaf in Europe, but the Jewish school for the deaf, that is, had already closed. And so this one that you heard about is the famous school for the deaf. And I just want to show you a few pictures from the survivors and children of survivors who spoke were speaking about. So this one has Hilda Wiener Rattner, Oma, that Janet was talking about. And you can see here pictures of Hilda's mother and her uncle, as well as her two daughters, Nellie and Lily, Janet's mother. And in this one, you have a picture of the young Helly, Lemberger, Udkovich that Hedy was talking about, and in a picture with her family, her parents and her younger sister. And then in this one, you see Ira's mom and his aunt. That's Hertha Gross Rothenberg Myers. And in the top left are her parents. So it's wonderful to have this great representation with us. I'm going to tell you now a little bit about the Deaf Holocaust Experience project that we started just about a year ago. And we really hope that it's going to help us all to preserve this very important history. So my name is Marla Petal, and I'm with the All the People. It's a small virtual company, and our co-founder, Michelle Barron, and I started this work about 40 years ago when we met when I was working for Temple Beth Solomon of the Deaf in Los Angeles. Now, although the experience of Nazi oppression and the Holocaust took place in the 1930s and the 1940s, little was spoken or written about that until the 1980s. Survivors did not really begin to speak openly about their experiences. And some, you heard, didn't want to ever speak about them. But at the 1981 World Congress of the Jewish Deaf, Sharon and I were both in Israel, and the German education teacher, Horst Wiesold, explained how he had felt compelled to become a historian in order to document the history of deaf victims of Nazi oppression, both Jewish and non-Jewish. So he shared his initial findings with the deaf world, and probably some others of you in the audience today were at that historic meeting. Now, Temple Beth Solomon of the Deaf in Los Angeles, the Hebrew Association of the Deaf in New York, and other Jewish deaf organizations also began to ask the survivors in their own community to share their experiences. And about that same time, Jewish deaf folklorist Simon Carmel also began to ask deaf survivors to share their testimony. Horst's documentation would come to include the primary evidence of the eugenics program of sterilization and euthanasia and the activities of deaf Nazis, as well as documentation about the Israelite School for the Deaf in Berlin, Weissensee. You're going to see just a brief look from Hedy 25 years ago at more than that, 35 years ago at the Temple Beth Solomon 25th anniversary in 1985.
I remember my parents would always go to different meetings, and I wanted to know what were all these meetings for? What's going on? My father explained to me. He said, you know, the deaf world is very small. And I said, yeah? I don't think I really understood what he was saying to me, but I said yes. And he said, you know, in that deaf world, there's an even smaller group of Jewish deaf people that's very tiny. And I said, yeah. And he said, we're going to try to keep the Jewish deaf community together by having a temple of our own. And I said, uh-huh. And then we bought our own temple over in our Arlita. It was a big thing in our lives. Oh, for the groundbreaking, I bought a new dress. And at the ribbon cutting, there was this big crowd. It was wonderful. And high up in front of the building, it said Temple Beth Solomon for the deaf. For? We protested. It had to come off. Change it to of. It's our temple. We run it. It's not run for us. No, it's of. I remember my parents would always go.
Sorry, I hope I didn't skip one here. Yeah. So survivors in Temple Beth Solomon community included Rose Feld Rossman, whose husband Max was an avid amateur photographer, and he had kept a photo album. Max kept pictures of himself and of Rose and their classmates at the Israelite School for the Deaf in Berlin. He documented their rich lives and community in the 1930s. Max kept pictures of himself and of Rose and their classmates. On field trips and having fun. And this one, which Max titled In der Nacht, became the title for an exhibition that we created using his photographs. And that exhibition was shown in a number of cities in the mid-1980s. Max also kept pictures of himself and Rose and their classmates at the Israelite School for the Deaf. These extraordinary photographs are of the the Alumni Association of the school in 1933 and 1934. Rose's artifacts included a brochure from the school and the watercolor greeting that Max sent her from the French labor camp where he was taken from their apartment in Paris. Max had preserved the photographs of their youth, their courtship, their marriage, and their daughter, Esther. On the right side, you see the final photos that Rose added to the album of Rose and Esther, who survived, and of Max, who was deported to Birkenau in September 1942 and perished there. Other deaf survivors in the US, like Ruth Danziger-Fallman in England, other deaf survivors like Ruth Danziger-Fallman in England and Marion Introtter in the US and many others in Israel began to share their photos and documents. But all of this was before the digital age, and most of these have not been made widely accessible. Getting to see a picture now that these Jewish deaf children of the diaspora were connected to each other around the world. We also learned in the 1980s of the life of David Bloch, deaf artist who had been a refugee in Shanghai. We didn't learn about David's artwork of his experience in the ghetto in Shanghai until after his death. But his work and artifacts have been preserved by his son, David, and his daughter-in-law, Gail, as well as his daughter in Germany. David worked hard to communicate the lessons of history by documenting his own experience in Dachau labor camp. And he communicated the horror and the long-term impacts of the Holocaust through a series of woodcut prints, as well as a series of oils. Public programs to recognize the history began in 1983 with Crying Hands, the first public memorial to deaf victims, where survivors provided their testimony and Horst Wieselt spoke and David Bloch exhibited his work. Then in 1985, the photo narrative exhibition In der Nacht was created and was mounted for the 1985 World Games for the Deaf. The US Holocaust Memorial Museum, which had not yet opened its new building, arranged for this display in the US Senate Office Building Rotunda and sponsored its tour to several cities where Jewish deaf groups organized talks with survivors and where David exhibited his work. Public programs to recognize this history took place not only in the United States, but also in Europe. Survivor testimonies began to be gathered by several existing organizations that were trying to do this systematically, but also by individual deaf historians and others. In fact, we have identified more than 100 videos and documentaries around the world about deaf survivors. But the quality of these videos varies a great deal. Some have full sign language, some do not, some are captioned, some are not, some are well translated, some are not. So there's a lot of work to be done to be able to have really full documentation so that these original firsthand testimonies are in good quality and can be used for research in the future as well. Over the years, several segments of news magazine shows have been produced in Austria, UK, US, and these have also been very important and deserve to be collected. There has been scholarship and documentation continuing in the 1990s, the 2000s, 2010, all very important as well. NTID faculty member Patty Durr created the Deaf People in World War II website and began to collect and make these materials accessible. Meanwhile, in Israel, the video testimony of about 50 deaf survivors was being collected. Over the years, there have been several biographies written by or about deaf people and their families, and several magazine and newsletter articles are also part of the documentation to be collected. There are memorials to Jewish deaf victims in Berlin, Amsterdam, and Tel Aviv. In spite of all of this very important work, access to this has been difficult and scholarship has been limited. Though this history was taught briefly in some university programs, today it is not part of deaf studies or Holocaust studies curriculum anywhere. In 2018, all the people and the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum agreed to begin a systematic project to document the Deaf Holocaust experience. To break through the silences, we have to go on to curate, narrate, and communicate this experience. This will be the labor of many. We are seeking additional partnerships with individuals and organizations to reach out to include the many organizations that can contribute to both collecting and amplifying the voices of victims and survivors, to achieve together what we cannot do alone. The priorities of the Deaf Holocaust Experience over the next 5 years will be to complete the collection, preservation, curation of all of this precious documentation. We want to support young deaf people to engage in scholarship, education, and art in order to continue to teach and find new ways to communicate this history for generations to come. We want to reconnect with the Jewish deaf community globally to be part of this process. To follow our progress, we invite you to join the Deaf Holocaust Experience page on Facebook or send a note to us to be on our mailing list. Thank you very much. Back over to you, Sharon.
Hello, and thank you, Marla. It really was a lot of hard work that you just showed us there, working together, sharing our history, documenting the museum in particular, and for future generations. Thank you, Marla. Now we're ready for question and answers. I have a few that I got through email, and so we're going to start with that first. Let's welcome all and ask questions specifically to people. All right, good. Thank you, thank you. Thank you all for sharing your story. Thank you. And now we'll ask questions. We can answer some questions. If you want to answer that question, please raise your hand. Let's see. What was communication like at camp, in the concentration camp? What was communication like? Anybody want to answer that question? I don't have any idea. I mean, I would probably take a guess, but really I can't imagine. I would think that Jewish deaf people lived in fear. They used their eyes a lot, and they would be visually acute, but yeah, it depended on who was close by. If it was a friend or if somebody was right next to them, then they could probably facilitate communication using cues so that they could live there. But I would guess, I mean, I really don't have any idea. Ira, do you have any idea? I mean, there was one deaf person there. Sometimes she would ask her sister, my mother would ask her sister, and then they would, it would be limited. So maybe that was the case. I think it's pretty typical. Were they all signing at the time, or were they using oral forms of communication? No, they would sign. They would sign. A mix of Hungarian, and German Sign Language, I think. A mixture. Good.
Mark Zorov, who is a Jewish German researcher, has written a chapter in a book about sign language interpretation in the concentration camps. And so it's part of another book about interpreting in camps. So there is some documentation that has been gathered about that subject.
Oh, okay. All right, that's good. How did you deal with deaf silence around you when there was screaming, shooting, heard, assuming that there was no hearing aids? Or, I mean, did you find it difficult to imagine what it was like for a deaf person when you can't hear, or there were screams or shots or crying? I mean, what would that experience be like? Can any of you describe that? Okay, I mean, my Oma said that she used her eyes, that she would use her eyes and it was very alert and she would see a lot. But as far as news or radio, then she used her mother, who happened to be hearing. Grandmother being deaf, she wasn't able to read lips, and grandmother didn't sign. Her mother didn't sign, so she spoke German. It was easier for her to read lips than it was English. I mean, English was much more complicated. But she did the best she could. That was the limits that she had to work with. She probably could feel the vibrations if there were shots being fired. I don't know. Well, my grandmother, before she escaped, I mean, I don't know. I don't know. Thank you. Anyone else? My husband, Ron, his mother's was also a Holocaust survivor from Berlin, Germany, and she saw Hitler too as well during one of his parades. And she often described that a very confusing time because there was so much happening and so much movement, and visually it was very hard for a deaf person to follow, to understand without having someone explain it to them. It wasn't until she came to the United States, to America, that she understood and made the connection of what she saw in Hitler to Hitler, the historical figure. She had no idea who this man was with the mustache at the time. And that was Hitler's, I mean, I assume that was her perspective of Hitler as we today, when we're in a large group of people and there is some sort of demonstration and protest, it's probably the same feeling of confusion of what's going on here, unless there is an interpreter available. That's what I would assume. I mean, I could make that parallel. I'm sure that emotionally, that's probably the level that they had to deal with. It would if it happened today with one of us. Did you want to say something? Remember, my mother, her parents were deaf, and I don't know if the aunt would say this is what was going on. If our aunt would say that, if she were still alive, she might be able to say what was happening. But for my mother, no, except in Bergen, Belsen. One day she heard an explosion in people. They saw someone lying on the ground, and so she heard an explosion inside of the camp. Thank you, Ira. Okay. And the next question is, do you remember what year you first heard the new word Holocaust? What was your response to that word when you first learned of the word Holocaust? Ira is talking with his mother, who is a survivor. So we're letting the audience know that's who he's talking to. How did you feel when you saw? How did you feel? Ira? I just asked my mother, who was nearby here, who remembered it was probably not way back when, but probably later. Probably she doesn't exactly know the exact word, but she felt just shocked to see the word Holocaust. And we have time for one more question. from the audience, if anyone wants to ask a question. There's one other question here. What would your thoughts of today, detainment of undocumented citizens south of the border in internment camps for Japanese Americans during the 1940s? We need to document this today. Many of them are south of the border. I mean, can you, Marla, can you relate to that?
I really thank you for that question, because when we talk about the Holocaust experience, we say the words never again, but we can see that it's happened again. And I think that we ourselves, if you are interested to help, we can all be trying to collect that experience. As far as the Japanese Americans, Patty Durr on her website has some documentation about the deaf experience there. But right now, what's happening at the border with Mexico, something that depends on us to find out and document and try to prevent and help.
Thank you, Marla. Ira. It really disgusts me when I see this. People put into camps, families separated, children separated. It's really disgusting to me. What is the government doing? That's how I feel. Okay. Well, let's see if the audience wants one more questions before we go to the next. Oh, for those of you who experience PTSD, have any of you experienced PTSD? Any of you experienced that? Janet? Yes. When my family decided to celebrate my grandmother's, Oma's, I think it was her 86th birthday. The Ellis Island Museum hadn't been opened yet, and we were very excited. We didn't want Oma to miss that, so we asked if we could perhaps have a chance to get in before it was open to the public. And so sure enough, we were able to get in and take a tour, and it was only our family together. And we met the park ranger there, who worked in Ellis Island. And my Oma was really, what's wrong, Oma? She goes, he's a German. That park ranger is a German. He looks like one of the German soldiers. I said, no, Oma, he works here at the park. That was confusing to her. And she said that that guy, the way he was dressed, the park ranger, looked like a German soldier to her. And he looked Aryan. And of course, my Oma was very scared. And he said, no, I'm not from Germany. My family perhaps in the past was, but I was born in the United States. And that, of course, calmed down my grandmother. I mean, she really carried that experience with her to the point where she thought a park ranger was a German. Thank you for sharing that. That's very important. Anyone else want to comment on that? Hedy? My mother would never answered any, I mean, regarding PTSD, except in, I mean, we refused to discuss the experience of her own personal experience, but I did see some PTSD effects in myself, being the first generation child from a Holocaust survivor, in that I still to this day, I'm still frightened to go to Germany, still frightened. And in fact, we did go to the Olympic Games in Denmark, and we took a train from Denmark to France. And as we were on the train, we went through Germany, and I couldn't sleep, and I couldn't sleep at all. I was so frightened because, I mean, it was an old train, and it felt like a train in the 1940s with the wooden walls and the curtains. And at that very point, I mean, I could not sleep because I imagined myself back then. And even though everyone else was asleep, as soon as that train got to the destination in France, I got right off, and they asked for our passports, and I thought that it was a German officer. I really imagined myself being back in Germany then, and they asked for passports, and fortunately I thought it was something else. But I got a flashback then that I even though I never went to the Holocaust, for some reason my mother's experience left a mark on me, and that was terrible. Thank you for sharing that, Ira. PTSD, could you repeat the question? I asked my mother, and she said that not often, but every once in a while, she would feel a little bit off sorts, and as the years went by, it lessened with time. Thank you. But there was one time that she had a dream that she still has a recurring dream of being home in Bratislava. And that she was on the street and wanted to look at her, she looked at her home, but it was gone until I went with her and actually visited and saw that the home is still there, that it still stands. And when she got back home a few weeks later, she still had the same dream. And she knew that the building was there, but after seeing it, now in her dream, the apartment was back where it was. And she could see a light behind the curtain in her apartment, in her home. And she never had that dream again. Thank you for sharing. All right, we need to wrap this up, this program, at 12:30. So thank you all. Thank you for sharing, for participating. It's very important to document this point in history, and we want to end up by teaching everyone together how to sign never again. Never again. Never. Okay, in the audience, let's sign together. Sign never again. Never again. And many, many thanks to Jack Jason for your interpreting through all of this. Thank you, Jack.
Jack, I would like to add also. So on behalf of the World Zionist Organization, I would like to thank all of the participants today, to Janet, to Hedy, and to Ira, and to Ira's mother as well. It was a really, really privilege to listen to your stories, and I really believe that as a people, learning about our diversity really makes us stronger. And as a hearing person, I can say that I wish that we will learn more about the history of deaf Jews with regard to the Holocaust and with no regard to the Holocaust. So thank you so much for this opportunity. And I also would like to thank Jack for his interpretation. Thank you so much. And last but not least, Sharon and Marla, we, I think, created a great thing, important thing together. And I'm really grateful for the work that we did together and looking forward for future collaborations. So thank you so much for everybody who participated and joined us. It was a huge privilege for us. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Thank you for all the participants for joining us today. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Thank you for your support. Bye-bye.